Hello and welcome to the first of many tutorials brought to you by JMD Media Lab. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at the exposure triangle, and exposure is a vital skill that photographers need to know and understand when they're out taking pictures and they want to create the correct exposure for their shots. So the first one of these elements we're going to be looking at today is this one called aperture. Now our aperture resides inside our lenses. It's a circular opening in the middle of the lens which allows light to come into the camera. So a wide opening generally lets in as much light as possible, with a smaller opening reducing the amount of light that comes in. Now the size of these openings are measured in what's known as f-stops. So anytime you see a number in photography with an f in front of it, you know you're dealing with aperture. And they can range, there's f1.4 for example, 1.8, 2.8, those are considered to be quite wide aperture openings, with f11, f16, f22 being quite small openings. So here's a chart just to give you some visual representation of how the aperture openings reflect to the numbers. And as you can see, the smaller the opening, like f2.8 for example, is producing the smaller number, f2.8 sorry, is producing a wider opening on our aperture ring, where f22, the bigger number, is creating a smaller opening. So one other thing you should know about aperture is that it also controls the depth of field in our image. And the term depth of field is meant by how much of your image is sharp and in focus. And working with a large aperture opening such as f2.8 creates a shallow depth of field, and that's most commonly found in portrait photography, where the photographers really wanted to focus on the subject, the main subject, the person in the picture, and they wanted to eliminate the background, so the background's all blurry. So those kind of effects are produced by having a wide aperture opening when you're taking your pictures. Now, on the opposite scale of that, working with a smaller aperture opening, such as f22, creates a greater depth of field in our image. More things will be sharp and in focus, and that's most commonly found in landscape photography, where the photographers really wanted to recreate the size of the scene for their audience, so that anyone who wasn't there can get an idea of how big and how vast that scene was. And to do that, you generally need a smaller aperture opening. So taking a look again at going back to this aperture chart and how it reflects to depth of field, we can see under f2.8 is producing, with the wide aperture opening, is producing a shallow depth of field, and using that f22 is creating a greater depth of field. So we can see how that whole range sort of relates to each other. Here's a photo that I took at Notting Hill Carnival. I got a street portrait of a gentleman. I really wanted the audience to focus on him, so I've used a really wide aperture opening of f2.8, which has allowed me to blur out the background. As you can imagine, it's a street party, so there's a lot of busy things happening, and I don't want the audience to be distracted by that, so I've blurred that out by using a wide aperture opening. Here's a landscape photo that I found on the internet. The photographers definitely wanted to recreate the size of that scene, so they've used a smaller aperture opening to recreate the size of that scene. So I don't know the settings exactly, but I'm imagining they would have probably used f2.22, maybe even beyond, maybe even f16, but it's allowed us it's allowed the photographer to capture as many things in that scene, sharp and in focus as possible, and us as viewers, we can get an idea of the distance between the photographer and those trees and the hills beyond. That's part one. Thank you for joining me, and come back for part two, where we look at shutter speeds.